The blood on her knuckles had dried by the time they dragged her to the altar. Seraphine Voss did not cry. She had made that decision 3 days ago when her father signed the agreement across the long oak table in the Blackmore packhouse and didn't look at her once while doing it. Not once. His pen scratched the parchment, his jaw was set, and his eyes stayed fixed somewhere to the left of his own soul. She had stood in the doorway and watched him sell her, and she had decided then, no tears. Tears were currency she refused to spend on men who had already decided her value. The altar was a stone platform at the center of the Blackmore territory, carved from obsidian rock, older than the pack's name. Torches burned on either side in iron cradles. The ceremony was not romantic. It was never meant to be. A bonding rite between alphas and their claimed mates was a thing of dominance, not devotion. You stood, you bled, you were marked. And then you belonged to someone who had not earned you. She stood now in a white dress that was not hers. It had been brought to her room that morning by 2 women from the Blackmore pack who didn't speak to her, just laid it across the bed and left. It was beautiful in the way weapons are sometimes beautiful, cold, precise, designed entirely for someone else's satisfaction. She wore it because refusing would have cost her father his life. That was the arrangement. Compliance for survival. A trade she hated with every nerve in her body. The crowd gathered in a half-circle beyond the torches. 100 wolves, maybe more. Some of them watched her with open curiosity. Others with pity so thin it was almost insult. None of them moved to stop what was happening. That told her everything she needed to know about what kind of pack this was. Then he came. Dorian Blackmore walked out of the darkness the way all truly dangerous things do, quietly, without announcement, as if the world had no choice but to simply part for him. He was tall, broad at the shoulder, with a jaw like something cut from the same obsidian as the altar beneath her feet. His dark hair was loose. His eyes, when they found hers across the flame, were the color of deep winter gray, almost silver, with no warmth anywhere inside them. He looked at her the way you look at something you have acquired. Not won. Acquired. Seraphine held his gaze. She would not look away. That much she had promised herself. Something flickered across his face. Not respect exactly. More like recalibration, the brief adjustment of a man who had expected submission and received something else instead. He climbed the altar steps and stood before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his skin, that unnatural warmth that all alphas carried like a slow fire in their blood. "Voss," he said. His voice was low. It moved through her chest like a stone dropped in still water. "Dorian Blackmore," she replied, her voice steady. "Let's get this over with." Elder, a gray-bearded wolf named Crest, began the rite. Old words, old tongue, the kind of language that predated the English the packs now used, sounds that still meant something to the animal under the skin. Seraphine kept her eyes forward. She heard the words without letting them land. She was still deciding what survival looked like from this point forward when Dorian reached out and took her wrist. His grip was firm. Not painful, but communicating something very clearly about its capacity to become so. And then something happened. It started as heat. Not the ambient warmth of his proximity, something deeper, something beneath her sternum like a coal that had been dormant for years suddenly catching air. It spread outward through her ribs, down her arms, up into her throat. She had felt the edges of her wolf before. Everyone did after their first shift at 16, that constant low hum of a second consciousness living just behind your own. But this was different. This was not a hum. This was a growl. Her wolf, the one she had spent years learning to contain, years keeping quiet because the alternative frightened her in ways she couldn't name, lifted its head. Seraphine blinked. Her vision did not change, but something about the quality of her awareness did, like a second set of eyes opening inside the first. She felt the crowd. She felt the torches. She felt Dorian Blackmore's pulse through the grip on her wrist, steady and slow and deliberately controlled, the heartbeat of a man performing calm. And she felt something else. Below the altar, beneath the obsidian stone, something was buried. She couldn't explain how she knew. She simply knew the way wolves know things that have no language, in the body, in the blood, in the part of the brain that was older than reason. Something was buried there, something that did not want to stay buried. In the sight of the pack, before stone and fire, Crest was still speaking. Dorian was watching her now with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Narrow-eyed, alert. Like a predator who had just noticed unexpected movement in the brush. "You feel it," he said, not a question, barely above a whisper. For her alone, Seraphine said nothing, his grip on her wrist tightened. The elder presented the blade, a curved bone-handled knife used exclusively for the bonding cut. The tradition was simple. The alpha cut his palm, the mate cut hers, blood was pressed together, and the rite was sealed. After that, the bond was biological, irreversible. Woven into the nervous system of both wolves, so that separation became a kind of slow poisoning. It was designed to be a chain disguised as a sacred act. Crest extended the blade to Dorian first. Dorian took it without looking away from Seraphine. She watched him draw the blade across his palm, precise, practiced, no flinch. Dark blood welled up. He turned the knife and held it out to her. She took it. And in the half-second between receiving the blade and raising it to her own skin, her wolf moved. Not a nudge, not a suggestion. A full-body lurch, like something enormous shifting inside her, throwing its weight in a direction Seraphine hadn't chosen. Her hand, the one holding the knife, turned. Not toward her own palm, toward the obsidian stone at her feet. She drove the blade into the altar. The crack it made was not the sound of bone meeting stone. It was deeper than that, older. Like the sound a lock makes when the right key is finally, after a very long time, turned. The torches went out. Every single one, simultaneously, as if the darkness had been waiting just outside the firelight and had finally been given permission to enter. Gasps moved through the crowd. Someone shouted. Seraphine felt the altar vibrate beneath her feet, a low tremor that moved up through her soles and into her spine, and her wolf howled, internally, silently, with a ferocity that rattled every bone she had. Dorian's hand closed around her arm like iron. "What did you do?" he said, and for the first time the control in his voice cracked clean down the middle. The tremor beneath the altar deepened. The ground shifted, and from somewhere below the obsidian stone, below the ancient carved rock that had held 100 bonding rites, that had sealed 100 chains, something began to push upward. Seraphine could not have explained what she felt next in any language designed for ordinary experience. It was recognition. Not of a memory, but of a truth, one that had always existed, waiting for exactly this moment to become available to her. The thing buried beneath the Blackmore altar was not a thing at all. It was a name, her real name. The one given to her not by her father, not by any pack, but by whatever had made her, the original Naming, the deep one, the one written in blood and moon and the space between a wolf's first howl and its last breath. And it was enormous. The ground split. Not catastrophically, a hairline fracture running from the altar base outward, through the soil, 2 feet, 5 feet, 10. And from it rose a sound that was not quite sound, more a pressure, a resonance, the kind of frequency that makes wolves submit without understanding why. Every wolf in the crowd dropped to one knee. Every wolf except Dorian Blackmore, who was still gripping her arm, his silver eyes wide and wild and burning with something that was equal parts fury and terror. "Who are you?" he breathed. Seraphine looked at him. Her wolf looked through her. And in a voice that was hers but also older and wider and terrifyingly calm, she said, "I'm beginning to remember." Nobody moved. The crack in the earth breathed. There was no other word for it. A slow, rhythmic exhale rising from the fissure, warm and mineral-scented, like the inside of something that had been sealed for a very long time. The torches were still dead. The only light came from the moon overhead, full and aggressive, pouring silver across the obsidian altar and the faces of 100 kneeling wolves who did not fully understand why their legs had buckled. Seraphine understood slowly that she was the reason. The knowing came in fragments, the way dreams do when you try to hold them after waking, not a flood, but a series of images pressing through a narrow gap. Flashes of a woman she didn't recognize standing on a cliff at the edge of a territory whose borders she somehow knew. A symbol carved into stone, the same symbol, she now noticed, that ran along the base of the Blackmore altar, barely visible beneath centuries of weathering. A howl that wasn't one howl but many, layered, ancient, carrying something forward through time the way rivers carry sediment, invisibly, persistently, without choice. And underneath all of it, a single thread of certainty pulling taut in her chest. She had been brought here on purpose, Not by her father, not by Dorian Blackmore's power or his pack's political pressure. Something older than both had arranged this. She was standing on this altar not because she had been sold, she had been delivered. The distinction should have been comforting. It was not. Dorian's grip on her arm had not loosened. If anything, the pressure had increased, not with aggression now, but something that felt disturbingly like anchor, as if releasing her might result in something he was not prepared to manage. She turned to look at him fully and found his expression remade entirely. The cold performance of authority was gone. In its place was a man doing rapid and private calculation, his jaw tight, his silver eyes moving between her face and the fissure in the ground with the controlled urgency of someone who has had a plan for years and just watched it become complicated. "Close it," he said quietly. "I didn't open it. You drove the knife into the stone." "My wolf drove the knife into the stone." She met his eyes. "There's a difference, and I think you know that." Something passed across his face. Recognition quickly buried. He knew something. He had known something before tonight, before she arrived, possibly before his name was ever written on her father's parchment. And the shape of that knowledge was visible now in the way he was working very hard not to show it. Elder Crest had risen from his knee. He was the only wolf in the crowd who had, and he was staring at the altar not with the shock that marked every other face, but with an expression Seraphine could only read as horrified confirmation. The look of a man watching a prophecy arrive exactly on schedule despite years of hopping it wouldn't. "Alpha," Crest said, his voice carrying the particular steadiness of old men who have outlived their own fear. "The rite must be completed. If the bond is not sealed before the fissure closes." "I'm aware," Dorian said, the words clipped and final. "What happens if it doesn't close?" Seraphine asked. Neither man answered. That itself was the answer. She looked down at the crack in the earth. The warmth rising from it had not diminished. If anything, it had grown more present, more specific, as if it were directed at her alone, the way sunlight falls differently on things it was designed to grow. Her wolf was quiet now, not retreated but settled, patient in the way of something that has made its move, and is waiting to see what the board does next. Seraphine crouched. Dorian's grip shifted with her movement but didn't stop her. She pressed her uncut palm flat against the obsidian stone beside the embedded knife, and the moment her skin met the ancient rock she saw it, not with her eyes but with whatever sense her wolf had thrown open like a window. Below the altar in the packed earth and old stone lay bones, not scattered remains, an intentional burial. A wolf interred in a position of formality, surrounded by objects she couldn't fully see but could feel, objects of significance, objects placed by hands that understood what they were protecting and from whom. The bones were old, impossibly old, and they were glowing in her second sight with a light that had no physical source, a luminescence that existed only in the stratum between the world she lived in and the one her wolf knew, and the bones were hers. Not hers, not this body, not this life, but hers in the deeper sense, the thread sense, the river sense. A previous version of herself so far back the distance felt geological. An ancestor so direct the connection was less like heritage and more like reflection. She had been here before. She stood up. Dorian was watching her with an intensity that had abandoned all pretense of dominance and arrived somewhere more honest, somewhere closer to need. She didn't like what that meant. A man like Dorian Blackmore needing something was infinitely more dangerous than a man like Dorian Blackmore wanting something. Want could be redirected. Need was structural. "Tell me what you know," she said. "Here," she said, "here, in front of your pack and your elder and whatever is underneath this stone listening to us. Here." A muscle worked in his jaw. Around them the kneeling wolves remained still, caught between instinct and confusion, the authority of their alpha and the impossible gravity of whatever Seraphine had become in the last 4 minutes. "Your bloodline," Dorian said finally, the words released the way a man releases something he's held at cost, "is the only one that can open the vault beneath this altar. It has not been opened in 300 years. He paused. "I needed a Voss female bonded to this territory standing on this stone. The rite was the mechanism. The bond would have given the vault a living key." Silence that followed had a texture. "You didn't want a mate," Seraphine said. I wanted what's inside the vault. My father, Dorian said nothing, which was more honest than anything he could have spoken. Her father had not simply been pressured. He had been informed. He had known what Dorian needed her for, and he had signed the parchment anyway, and he had not looked at her. The grief of it moved through her cleanly, the way very old pain does, not sharp, not explosive, just a slow and total weight. She filed it away. There would be time for that later if there was a later. What's in the vault? She asked. Power. That tells me nothing. It tells you everything, he said. It's the only thing anyone has ever put in a vault. She almost laughed. A reflex she hadn't expected, dark and involuntary, something her wolf seemed to approve of because she felt it stir with what she could only describe as amusement. Good, she thought at it. We need to be sharp. The bond is broken, she said. I won't be completing the rite. If you don't complete the rite, the vault opens anyway. I felt it. The knife in the stone did what you needed the bond to do, except now you don't own me while it does it. She held his gaze. That seems like my best available outcome. Stared at her. For a long moment the only sound was the breathing of the earth below and the quiet shift of 100 wolves uncertain what to do with their knees. Then from the far edge of the crowd, a wolf stood up. Not slowly, not with the tentative unfolding of someone testing permission. He rose fast and deliberate, and the ripple that moved through the gathered pack at his standing was different from the earlier instinct. This was social. Loaded, the specific tension of a room watching someone choose a side at a moment when sides still mean everything. He was young. Mid-20s, lean in the way of speed rather than mass, with close-cropped hair and eyes that were darker than the night around him. Seraphine did not know him, but her wolf did something she had never felt it do before. It went very still, the particular stillness of recognition, the held breath before a name. Dorian turned. When he saw who had stood, the control he'd been maintaining with such visible effort finally, completely broke. Chaos, he said, and the single word carried three things at once: fury, history, and fear. The young wolf looked past Dorian entirely. He looked at Seraphine, and what was on his face was not the hungry acquisitiveness of the alpha beside her, not pity, not calculation. It was something that made no sense given that they had never met. Something that made her wolf throw its whole weight against the inside of her ribs like a tide slamming a seawall. Complete the rite, Caius said. As if she needed the warning. As if he needed to say it anyway. The fissure in the earth pulsed once, a single deep vibration, and the bone-handled knife still embedded in the altar began slowly to sink. The vault was opening, and Seraphine finally understood why Dorian had been afraid. What was inside was never meant for him. The knife disappeared into the stone like water into sand. No sound. No resistance. The obsidian simply received it, the bone handle sinking flush with the altar surface and then below it, swallowed completely, and the fissure in the ground responded by widening, not dramatically, not with the theatrical violence of an earthquake, but with the slow, inexorable patience of something that had been waiting 3 centuries for exactly this, and saw no reason to rush now that it had arrived. The warmth coming up from below changed quality. It had been mineral before, earthy, the breath of sealed stone. Now it was something Seraphine felt in her blood rather than her lungs, a resonance that moved through her circulatory system like a second pulse, syncopating with her own heartbeat until the two rhythms found each other and locked. Her wolf was no longer still. It was rising. Not shifting, she wasn't going to shift. She could feel the distinction clearly, the way you feel the difference between standing up and falling forward even when both involve leaving the ground. This was vertical, an elevation of presence, of density, as if the animal inside her was becoming more itself with every inch the fissure widened, feeding on whatever was exhaling from the deep. Everyone back. Dorian's voice cut across the clearing with the full authority of an alpha command, the kind that bypassed conscious choice and went straight to the hindbrain. The kneeling wolves scrambled upright and retreated in a single collective movement, the crowd pulling back to the tree line like a tide going out. Obedient. Conditioned. Caius didn't move. Dorian turned to face him fully, and Seraphine watched the space between the two men the way you watch a bridge that may or may not hold, measuring it, calculating, understanding that whatever was structural between them had already been stressed past its original design. "You were exiled," Dorian said. "I came back. That sentence ends with your death if I choose. You won't choose it tonight." Caius's eyes moved briefly, deliberately, to the altar beneath Seraphine's feet. "You need her functional. Killing me in front of her right now tells her exactly what kind of man she's dealing with, and you've already spent most of your credibility." A pause. "Besides, she already knows." Seraphine studied Caius across the torchless dark. Her wolf's reaction to him was unlike anything she had a framework for. Not attraction, or not only attraction, something more fundamental than that, more structural, like the specific recognition of a supporting wall inside a building you thought you knew entirely. She had assumed her wolf's jolt at seeing him was instinctive animal response. Looking at him now, at the careful steadiness of him, the way he stood in Dorian Blackmore's territory at the edge of an exile sentence with the relaxed precision of a man who had planned for every variable, she began to revise that assumption. "You knew this was happening tonight," she said. Caius looked at her. "Yes." "How?" "Because I've been watching Dorian prepare for it for 2 years. He took 3 steps forward, stopping a careful distance from the altar, from her, from Dorian, a triangle of positioning that seemed chosen rather than incidental. "I know what's in the vault, Seraphine." Her name in his mouth did something she refused to examine in present company. "Tell me," she said. "It's not a what," Caius said. "It's a who." The fissure pulsed. The altar trembled once beneath her feet. And then, from below the obsidian stone, rising through the crack in the earth with the slow thermal certainty of something that existed at a temperature beyond ordinary fire, came light. Not torchlight, not moonlight. Something older than both, amber-silver and dense, moving with a viscosity that light had no business having, pooling upward through the fissure the way groundwater rises through cracked stone after heavy rain. It filled the clearing from below, casting shadows upward rather than down, turning every face in the tree line into something unfamiliar and strange. Seraphine dropped to one knee, not from weakness. Her wolf dropped her deliberately, the way you kneel before something you recognize as greater than you, without diminishment, without defeat, with the specific gravity of acknowledgement. She pressed her palm flat on the altar, and the light moved toward her hand like a living thing, like a creature following warmth. It touched her skin, and she remembered everything. Not her own life, not the memories of Seraphine Voss, daughter of a man who wouldn't look at her, wolf of no pack that wanted her. Older memories, the ones stored below conscious thought, below language, in the place in the brain where wolves keep what their ancestors knew. They came not as images this time, but as pure knowledge, arriving complete and immediate the way instinct does, entire and unasked for. The woman buried below the altar had been the first alpha. Not the first Blackmore alpha, not the first alpha of any pack with a name, the first alpha. The original, the source, the wolf from whom every alpha bloodline in existence had descended across 3 millennia of shifting and splitting and diluting. Her name, in the old tongue, translated to something that had no modern equivalent, something between sovereign and origin, and the specific loneliness of being the first of any kind. She had not been buried here as an honor. She had been buried here as a seal. The power she carried, the power every alpha inherited in diluted fractions, had not died with her body. It had been contained, deliberately, by wolves who understood what would happen if it ever fully manifested in a single living vessel again. They had chosen a bloodline to carry the key and a territory to serve as the lock, and they had arranged everything with the long-game patience of people who understood they would not live to see the consequences of either outcome. The Voss bloodline carried the key, always had. Every generation, one woman, the one whose wolf ran deepest, the one who could access the layer beneath ordinary shifting. She was the key. And whoever stood her on this altar, in this territory, on this stone, would determine whether the lock opened for them or against them. Dorian had understood enough of the old texts to know he needed a Voss female bonded to his land. He had not understood the crucial distinction. The vault didn't open for the alpha who arranged the ceremony. It opened for the Voss wolf herself. The bond was never meant to give the key to the Alpha. The bond was meant to be the chain that prevented the key from using the door on her own terms. He hadn't been trying to access ancient power. He had been trying to own the woman who carried it. And call that the same thing. Seraphine rose from her knee. The light from the fissure had reached her fully now, moving up her legs, her torso, threading through her ribcage with a warmth that was not painful but was absolute. The way being known is sometimes overwhelming even when it isn't unkind. Her wolf was not rising anymore. It had risen. It stood fully present behind her eyes, inside her hands, along her spine, not separate from her but undeniably itself, enormous and ancient, and carrying the accumulated depth of every Voss woman who had passed the key forward without ever knowing what lock it fit. She looked at Dorian. He had gone pale. Not the pale of fear, exactly. The pale of a man watching a calculation he had built his last 2 years on reveal an error so fundamental that no adjustment could correct it. His silver eyes moved between her face and the light surrounding her, and she watched him make the decision she had been waiting for. The one she had known was coming from the moment he said the word power with that particular quality of hunger. He lunged, not for her throat. For her wrist, the original grip, the controlling grip, the grip of a man who understood that if he could establish physical dominance in the next 3 seconds, he might still redirect what was happening. He was fast, alpha fast, the kind of speed that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with what he was, and under ordinary circumstances it would have been enough. Caius hit him from the side. The impact was significant. Both men went down hard off the altar steps, Dorian rotating mid-fall with the reflexes of a born fighter, getting a forearm across Caius's throat before they hit the ground, using the landing to reverse position, and then stopping. Going completely still, because Seraphine's hand was at the back of Dorian's neck, not gripping, resting. The lightest possible contact, 2 fingers against the base of his skull, and the light that had filled her was moving through that contact point in a thin, concentrated stream, and every wolf at the tree line had gone silent with the dense unanimity of a pack receiving a signal from above their alpha, Him go, she said quietly. Dorian released Caius. Slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing to comply in a way that preserved the fiction of it being a choice. Seraphine removed her hand. The stream of light withdrew. She stepped back. Caius got to his feet and said nothing, which she was grateful for. This was not a moment for commentary. Dorian stood, straightened, looked at her with those winter eyes, and for a single unguarded second she saw it, what lived underneath the cruelty, underneath the architecture of authority he'd built so high and so deliberately that he'd perhaps forgotten it was architecture. Something damaged and desperate and very old in the way that certain wounds are old, the ones you stop trying to heal and simply build your personality around instead. She did not feel sorry for him, but she saw him, which was different, and she filed that away too. Pack, she said, turning to face the tree line. 100 wolves stood watching her in the upward cast amber light, some afraid, some uncertain, some wearing expressions she couldn't read yet, not knowing them well enough, all of them waiting. She had not asked for this. That felt important to acknowledge, internally if nowhere else. She had come here in a white dress that wasn't hers to be bound to a man she didn't choose, and something older than her had made a different decision on her behalf, and she was still working out how she felt about that, the liberation and the weight of it, the way they were the same thing depending on which direction you looked, but they were waiting. And the vault below was fully open now, the light steady and patient, and whatever came next was going to require someone to be standing at the front of it. She turned to Caius. He was watching her with that expression again, the one she didn't have language for yet. You said you know what's in there, she said. How? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because my bloodline was the one that sealed it. Clearing went absolutely still. 300 years ago, he continued, his voice steady but carrying something carefully controlled underneath it, a Caius wolf stood where Dorian is standing and made a choice. Not to take the power, to lock it, to bury it, to give up what his line could have claimed. He looked at her directly. He was waiting for the right vessel. Seraphine felt the pieces move. And you think I'm her, she said. I don't think anything, Caius said. Your wolf already told me. The fissure below, the light pulsed once, enormous, warm, and certain, and the ground gave a single resonant tone, low and vast, the kind of sound that lives in the chest rather than the ear. And then Dorian Blackmore, standing 5 feet behind her, said, "Then I suppose I have nothing left to lose." She heard the shift begin before she turned. The sound of a shifting alpha was unlike anything else in the natural world. It was not the wet biological rearrangement that novels like to describe, not the dramatic orchestral violence of Hollywood's imagination. It was a frequency, a dropping of all pretense at the cellular level, the human architecture simply stepping aside for what had always lived underneath it, and the sound it made was low and specific and arrived in the stomach before the ears processed it. Seraphine turned. Dorian Blackmore was already halfway through. His spine had lengthened, his shoulders broadened beyond the capacity of the shirt he'd worn, dark fur rising along his forearms in a wave that moved upward toward his jaw. His silver eyes had not changed. They were the last human thing remaining, and somehow that made them worse, that continuity of cold intelligence inside the animal, the proof that the wolf emerging was not separate from the man, but simply the man with all restraint surgically removed. He was enormous. The Blackmore alpha form was the largest she had ever seen outside of old illustrations in pack histories she'd studied as a child. Histories she had consumed obsessively the way all wolf children do, looking for themselves in the record, finding only the shapes of power they'd been told they'd never hold. The wolf that finished assembling itself from Dorian's body stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, black-furred and massive, with a head like a battering ram and haunches built for the kind of speed that ends before you see it start. It fixed her with those silver eyes, and it did not growl. Growling was a warning. Dorian had moved past warnings. Caius shifted without ceremony beside her. She felt rather than saw it, her attention locked on the black wolf advancing, and then Caius was beside her in his wolf form, gray-silver and lean, built like a current rather than a wall. She felt his shoulder briefly against her arm before he moved forward, placing himself between her and Dorian with a precision that was not heroic posturing, but tactical and deliberate and quietly devastating to some part of her she didn't have time to examine. 2 wolves met. It was fast and brutal and nothing like a performance. Caius was outweighed by a significant margin, and he knew it. She could see the knowledge in every choice he made, fighting the way smaller wolves survive larger ones, not by matching force but by refusing to be where the force landed. He moved around Dorian's mass like water around stone, sharp and redirecting, opening angles and closing them, buying time with the controlled expenditure of someone who understood his account was limited. He was good. He was very good. He was losing. Seraphine felt the vault beneath her feet, felt the light inside her, steady and full, the warmth of 3 centuries of stored waiting threaded through every vein she had. She felt her wolf, fully present, fully itself, the enormous ancestral depth of it filling her from the soles of her feet upward. She had spent years keeping this quiet. Years learning to present small, to run a controlled frequency, to never let the full weight of what her wolf was register in the social atmosphere of the packs she'd moved through. Because a woman carrying this much was inconvenient at best and threatening at worst, and the world had a long and consistent history of neutralizing whatever it found threatening in the bodies of women. She had made herself small to survive. She was done with that. She stepped off the altar. The moment her feet touched the earth, the light moved with her. It didn't leave the fissure, it extended from it, the vault below acting as a source rather than a container now, and she was the channel through which it traveled. It moved through the ground beneath her footsteps, forward through the soil, visible as a faint luminescence tracing her path in the dark. Dorian had Caius pinned. One massive forepaw at the gray wolf's throat, the full weight of him bearing down, and Caius was still, the specific stillness of a wolf conserving the last of its options. Dorian's silver eyes lifted to Seraphine as she approached. She watched something move through them, the recalculation she was beginning to recognize as his default response to her, the constant, frustrated revision of expectations she kept failing to meet. She stopped 3 feet away. She did not shift. She stood in the white dress that wasn't hers, barefoot on the torn earth, with the light of a 300-year-old vault moving through her body and her wolf wearing her like a second skin. And she looked at Dorian Blackmore's silver eyes inside the black wolf's face, and she spoke in the old tongue. She didn't know she knew it until she heard herself speaking it. The words arrived from the same place the memories had, from the layer below language where wolves kept what their ancestors understood, and they were not a command, not a threat, not the kind of authoritative performance she had watched Alpha after Alpha produce her entire life. They were something more serious than all of that. They were true. Every wolf at the tree line went down. Not to one knee this time, fully prostrate, bellies to the ground, chins forward. The involuntary total submission posture that no wolf could choose or resist. The response to a frequency so primary it predated the concept of a pack to belong to. It came from older wiring than loyalty, older than territory, older than any of the structures they had all built their lives inside. Dorian's forepaw lifted from Caius's throat. He fought it. She could see him fighting it, the silver eyes burning with the effort of a will powerful enough to have controlled a significant pack for years, straining against something that was not interested in his will, that preceded it, that would outlast it. His legs shook. His massive frame lowered inch by inch, the great black wolf descending against his own desire, and she stood and watched and did not look away because she wanted him to know. She needed him to know that this was not cruelty. She took no pleasure in the submission of anyone, even him. She was simply finished being small. Dorian's chin touched the ground, the light receded. The old words stopped. Seraphine exhaled and felt the vault's energy settle to a hum, no longer surging, finding its level inside her the way water finds its level, still present but no longer urgent. Caius shifted back beside her. She heard him rather than watched him. She was still watching Dorian. When Caius straightened to his human form, he was bleeding from a gash along his left ribs, breathing carefully, and he stood close enough that she was aware of his warmth without either of them making anything of it. "Is he going to be rational when he gets up?" she asked quietly. "He's always rational," Caius said. "That's what makes him dangerous." Dorian shifted back. It took longer than the shift out, the return always did. The human form requiring more reassembly than the wolf, the conscious architecture rebuilding itself piece by deliberate piece. He rose from the ground in stages, and when he finally stood, dressed in the ruins of what he'd been wearing, he looked at Seraphine with the expression of a man who has survived something he expected to kill him and is still working out what that means. "Vault," he said. His voice was rough. "If you don't bond it to a living wolf, it becomes unstable. The power has to be carried." "That was the design," he paused. "That was why I needed you bound to the territory, not to control you." Another pause, smaller, weighted differently. "Not only to control you." It was the most honest thing he had said all night. She wasn't certain it redeemed anything, but she registered it. "I know," she said. "I'm going to carry it." "You can't carry it unanchored. The old texts are clear. A Voss wolf carrying the full vault power without a territory bond is a vessel under pressure. It's not sustainable indefinitely." He looked at her steadily. "You need a pack, a territory, something to ground the channel. Then I'll build one." Silence that followed was a different kind of silence from all the previous ones. Not the silence of shock or submission or withheld information. The silence of something ending and something else, unnamed and undesigned, beginning to occupy the available space. Elder Crest spoke from somewhere behind the gathered wolves, his old voice carrying without effort. "There is precedent," he said, and she heard in his tone the sound of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something and had finally been given the correct moment. Before the packs divided, before territories were parceled and named, there was one seat of authority, itinerant, not bound to land but to bloodline. He moved through the crowd slowly, the wolves parting for him with a deference that seemed more instinctive than political. He stopped before the altar and looked at Seraphine with ancient, tired eyes. "We have not had a high wolf in 300 years. The words landed in the clearing like a stone in still water, rings moving outward. High wolf. She had read the term once, in a crumbling pack history so old the pages had gone amber at the edges. She had assumed it was mythology. The kind of origin story packs told about themselves to feel large. She had not considered it was a vacancy. She looked at Caius. He was watching her with that expression, the one she still didn't have a name for, the one her wolf had been reacting to since the moment he stood up in the crowd. She looked at him properly now, with the vault's clarity still moving through her, and she let herself understand what her wolf had been trying to tell her since the moment of recognition. The Caius bloodline had sealed the vault, had walked away from power 3 centuries ago, had chosen the lock over the key, had trusted that eventually the right vessel would stand on that stone. And they had kept that faith across 300 years of waiting, passing the knowledge down, watching the Blackmore pack build their authority over the burial site without ever letting them know what they were sitting on. Caius was not here by accident. He was not here as a rescuer or a romantic intervention or any of the shapes she might have initially reached for to explain him. He was here because his bloodline had made a promise, and he was the end of that promise's waiting. "You knew me," she said, "not accusation, confirmation. My grandmother described you," he said, "not your face, your wolf." A pause. "She said I'd know it when I felt it." Seraphine thought about a woman she'd never meet passing a description forward through time like a letter with a very long delivery. She thought about her own grandmother, dead before Seraphine was 4, leaving nothing behind that Seraphine had ever been given access to. She wondered now, with the vault's clarity still humming through her, what her grandmother might have known and who had decided she shouldn't. She filed that away. Another thread for another night. She turned to face the gathered pack. 100 wolves, most of them strangers, all of them watching her with the particular openness of people whose framework for the evening had been completely dissolved, and who were waiting, not passively but with genuine animal attention, to see what would replace it. She thought about what she wanted to say, thought about authority and how it was performed versus how it was inhabited. Thought about every alpha she had ever watched command a room and how much of it had been volume and posture and the weaponized confidence of people who had been told since birth that the room was theirs. She said simply, "You don't have to stay. What happened tonight changes nothing about your choice. A pack held together by fear is a pack waiting to fracture." She looked across them steadily. "But if you stay, it's different now. Understand that before you decide." No one left, not immediately. Some of them looked at each other. Some of them looked at the fissure in the earth, which had narrowed now to a hairline, the vault's energy having found its new residence. Some of them looked at Dorian, who was standing to the side with the careful stillness of a man recalibrating the entire architecture of his next move. Dorian. That was the unfinished business, and she knew it, and she suspected he knew she knew it, which made the next few seconds the most genuinely dangerous of the night, more dangerous than the shift, more dangerous than the altar, because this was the moment where pride and intelligence either aligned or went to war inside him. She walked to him, stopped 2 feet away. "A good strategist," she said quietly for him alone. "You read old texts most alphas don't know exist. You played a long game with patience most people don't have. You were wrong about the end game, but the work before it was real." She held his gaze. "I don't want an enemy who thinks that well." Dorian was very still. "You're offering me something. I'm telling you something true. What you do with it is yours." He looked at her for a long moment with those winter eyes, and she watched the calculation move through them. Not the frantic recalibration of earlier, but something slower, more fundamental, the kind of thinking that rearranges rather than adjusts. He would not be trustworthy overnight. She was not naive enough to believe one conversation rewrote years of who he'd been. But the seed of a different possible future was a real thing, and she had put it where he could find it, and that was all she could do. He dipped his chin. Not submission. Acknowledgement. She accepted it and turned away. The fissure closed. The last of the vault light sealed itself into her bloodstream with a warmth that she suspected was now permanent. Not a surge but a weather, something she would live inside from now on. That would require learning and management and the kind of sustained attention you gave to something genuinely powerful. She would make mistakes with it. She was certain of that with a clarity that felt oddly like peace. Caius fell into step beside her as she walked away from the altar. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Have no idea," she said. The moon overhead was beginning to pale at its edges, the first suggestion of a dawn still an hour away, and below them the Blackmore territory stretched in all directions, bordered and bounded and full of its own complicated history, and none of it felt like a cage anymore. Her wolf moved through her chest like a tide going in. She had been delivered to this altar as a key. She was leaving as the door. Whatever was on the other side of it, she was walking through on her own terms. And somewhere behind her in the dark, in the silence of a pack that had just felt the ground shift beneath everything they thought they knew, she heard it. One wolf, then two, then a dozen, then the whole tree line alive with it, rolling out across the territory like a wave that had no intention of stopping. They were howling, not for Dorian Blackmore, for her.